On the night of March 2nd, 1998, a 19-year-old college student stepped off a city bus onto her university campus, less than a minute's walk from her dorm, and then she vanished without leaving a single confirmed trace behind. Hours later, have someone used her debit card to withdraw exactly $20 from an ATM in a part of the city she rarely visited. What that withdrawal revealed would fracture assumptions, expose delays, and begin a mystery that still has no ending. Early March in upstate New York carried a particular kind of cold, the kind that lingered even when winter was technically ending. Snow still clung in thin gray patches along sidewalks, and the air around SUNY Albany's uptown campus smelled faintly of damp concrete, exhaust, and pine drifting in from the nearby pine bush. Students moved between buildings with collars turned up, backpacks slung low, minds already halfway toward spring break and warmer days. Suzanne Lyall moved through that world almost invisibly. At 19, she did not draw attention to herself, and she did not try to. She walked with her shoulders slightly forward, as if bracing against more than just the wind, her long, reddish-tinted blonde hair usually falling loose over dark sweaters. People who knew her described her the same way again and again. Quiet, thoughtful, predictable in the best possible sense. She had been that way since childhood. Growing up in Ballston Spa, Suzanne was the youngest of three, the one her siblings called the darling of the family. When inspiration struck, it struck hard. Her brother and sister remembered her bolting out of the shower, hair dripping onto the carpet, just to scribble lines of poetry into a notebook before the words disappeared. Music mattered to her, especially the band Rush, whose complex rhythms and lyrics appealed to her orderly, analytical mind. So did computers. While other teenagers used them casually, Suzanne dismantled and rebuilt them, learning how each piece fit, how systems worked beneath the surface. That need to understand carried into her education. She graduated from Ballston Spa High School with honors, then enrolled at SUNY Albany. After a year, she grew restless. The coursework felt too easy, too shallow. She wanted more. So she transferred to SUNY Albany, choosing computer science because it demanded precision, logic, and persistence, all qualities she already lived by. Her life quickly settled into a rhythm. Classes during the day, 2 off-campus jobs to help pay for school, one at a computer company in Troy, the other at a Babbage's computer store in Crossgates Mall, long bus rides between campus and work, evenings spent on her computer, chatting online or exchanging messages with her boyfriend, Richard Condon, who shared her interest in technology. He had even set up her computer so he could access it remotely from his own, something that felt practical, not intrusive, at least at the time. Suzanne did not drift. She checked in. She called or emailed her parents almost every day. Sometimes it was just a quick update, sometimes longer, meandering conversations about school, work, or nothing in particular. On March 1st, the night before she disappeared, she spoke to her mother, Mary. Suzanne mentioned she was low on cash, waiting for her next paycheck. Mary offered to help, to lend her some money until then. Suzanne declined. She always declined. Independence mattered to her, even when it made life tighter than it needed to be. She didn't like taking shortcuts, Mary would later say. At the time, it was just another small, familiar exchange between mother and daughter. In late February, Suzanne felt the pressure building. A midterm exam loomed, one she believed she needed not just to pass, but to excel on. Her manager at Babbage's noticed the change in her demeanor, still polite, still focused, but quieter than usual. Suzanne mentioned the exam casually, but the way she said it suggested more than casual concern. Failure, or even mediocrity, was not something she accepted easily. She took the exam on the morning of March 2nd. When it was over, she said she thought she had done okay. Not great, not terrible, just acceptable. The word lingered with her longer than she admitted. After class, she followed her routine. She returned to her dorm in the Colonial Quad on North Campus briefly, then prepared for work. The day remained uneventful, almost stubbornly ordinary. No arguments reported, no dramatic plans, no sudden changes, and yet, small details sat quietly beneath the surface. About a month earlier, Suzanne had confided something unusual to a coworker at Babbage's. She believed someone had been watching her, someone she didn't know. She didn't describe feeling afraid. She didn't change her habits. She mentioned it the way someone might mention an odd coincidence, then moved on. At the time, it raised no alarms. Her relationship with Richard also carried subtle tension. Suzanne had tried, more than once, to end it. Each time, she pulled back after he became emotional, choosing stability over confrontation. 2 weeks before her disappearance, while traveling with her mother to visit Mary's own mother, Suzanne asked to stop by Richard's house to drop off a Valentine's Day card. The visit was brief, uneventful. Still, Mary would later wonder if the card had been something else entirely. If Suzanne had gone there to close a chapter she no longer knew how to finish. No one could say that with certainty then. No one even suspected it. To the people around her on March 2nd, Suzanne Lyall was simply a diligent student balancing school, work, and relationships the way thousands of other students did every day. She didn't party. She didn't drink. She didn't take risks. She withdrew exactly $20 when she needed cash. Never more, never less. She caught the bus when her shift ended. She went home, or at least, she was supposed to. That evening, as daylight faded and the temperature dropped again, Suzanne gathered her things and left her dorm for her shift at Crossgates Mall. The mall lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, and inside Babbage's, the air smelled of plastic packaging and electronics that had been powered on too long. She worked until closing, just as she always did. Nothing about that day demanded attention. Nothing announced that it was different, and that was precisely what made what came next so devastating. Because when Suzanne Lyall followed her routine one last time, no one standing near her, no coworker, no classmate, no passerby, had any reason to believe they were seeing her for the final time. Early March in upstate New York carried a particular kind of cold, the kind that lingered even when winter was technically ending. Snow still clung in thin gray patches along sidewalks, and the air around SUNY Albany's uptown campus smelled faintly of damp concrete, exhaust, and pine drifting in from the nearby pine bush. Students moved between buildings with collars turned up, backpacks slung low, minds already halfway toward spring break and warmer days. Suzanne Gloria Lyall moved through that world almost invisibly. At 19, she did not draw attention to herself, and she did not try to. She walked with her shoulders slightly forward, as if bracing against more than just the wind, her long, reddish-tinted blonde hair usually falling loose over dark sweaters. People who knew her described her the same way again and again. Quiet, thoughtful, predictable in the best possible sense. She had been that way since childhood. Growing up in Ballston Spa, Suzanne was the youngest of 3, the one her siblings called the darling of the family. When inspiration struck, it struck hard. Her brother and sister remembered her bolting out of the shower, hair dripping onto the carpet, just to scribble lines of poetry into a notebook before the words disappeared. Music mattered to her, especially the band Rush, whose complex rhythms and lyrics appealed to her orderly, analytical mind. So did computers. While other teenagers used them casually, Suzanne dismantled and rebuilt them, learning how each piece fit, how systems worked beneath the surface. That need to understand carried into her education. She graduated from Ballston Spa High School with honors, then enrolled at SUNY Albany. After a year, she grew restless. The coursework felt too easy, too shallow. She wanted more, so she transferred to SUNY Albany, choosing computer science because it demanded precision, logic, and persistence, all qualities she already lived by. Her life quickly settled into a rhythm. Classes during the day, 2 off-campus jobs to help pay for school, one at a computer company in Troy, the other at a Babbage's computer store in Crossgates Mall. Long bus rides between campus and work, evenings spent on her computer, chatting online or exchanging messages with her boyfriend, Richard Condon, who shared her interest in technology. He had even set up her computer so he could access it remotely from his own, something that felt practical, not intrusive, at least at the time. Suzanne did not drift. She checked in. She called or emailed her parents almost every day. Sometimes it was just a quick update, sometimes longer, meandering conversations about school, work, or nothing in particular. On March 1st, the night before she disappeared, she spoke to her mother, Mary. Suzanne mentioned she was low on cash, waiting for her next paycheck. Mary offered to help, to lend her some money until then. Suzanne declined. She always declined. Independence mattered to her, even when it made life tighter than it needed to be. She didn't like taking shortcuts, Mary would later say. At the time, it was just another small, familiar exchange between mother and daughter. In late February, Suzanne felt the pressure building. A midterm exam loomed, one she believed she needed not just to pass, but to excel on. Her manager at Babbage's noticed the change in her demeanor. Still polite, still focused, but quieter than usual. Suzanne mentioned the exam casually, but the way she said it suggested more than casual concern. Failure, or even mediocrity, was not something she accepted easily. She took the exam on the morning of March 2nd. When it was over, she said she thought she had done okay. Not great, not terrible, just acceptable. The word lingered with her longer than she admitted. After class, she followed her routine. She returned to her dorm in the Colonial Quad on North Campus briefly, then prepared for work. The day remained uneventful, almost stubbornly ordinary. No arguments reported, no dramatic plans, no sudden changes. And yet, small details sat quietly beneath the surface. About a month earlier, Suzanne had confided something unusual to a coworker at Babbage's. She believed someone had been watching her, someone she didn't know. She didn't describe feeling afraid. She didn't change her habits. She mentioned it the way someone might mention an odd coincidence, then moved on. At the time, it raised no alarms. Her relationship with Richard also carried subtle tension. Suzanne had tried, more than once, to end it. Each time, she pulled back after he became emotional, choosing stability over confrontation. 2 weeks before her disappearance, while traveling with her mother to visit Mary's own mother, Suzanne asked to stop by Richard's house to drop off a Valentine's Day card. The visit was brief, uneventful. Still, Mary would later wonder if the card had been something else entirely, if Suzanne had gone there to close a chapter she no longer knew how to finish. No one could say that with certainty then. No one even suspected it. To the people around her on March 2nd, Suzanne Lyall was simply a diligent student balancing school, work, and relationships the way thousands of other students did every day. She didn't party, she didn't drink, she didn't take risks. She withdrew exactly $20 when she needed cash, never more, never less. She caught the bus. When her shift ended, she went home, or at least, she was supposed to. That evening, as daylight faded and the temperature dropped again, Suzanne gathered her things and left her dorm for her shift at Crossgates Mall. The mall lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, and inside Babbage's, the air smelled of plastic packaging and electronics that had been powered on too long. She worked until closing, just as she always did. Nothing about that day demanded attention. Nothing announced that it was different, and that was precisely what made what came next so devastating. Because when Suzanne Lyall followed her routine one last time, no one standing near her, no coworker, no classmate, no passerby, had any reason to believe they were seeing her for the final time. Night settled over Crossgates Mall in layers. By 9 o'clock, the steady hum of shoppers had thinned into scattered footsteps and the echo of rolling security gates. Inside Babbage's, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale sheen over rows of boxed software and computer accessories. Suzanne stood behind the counter, finishing her closing routine with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. Straightening displays, counting receipts, locking drawers. The store smelled faintly of plastic, dust, and the lingering warmth of electronics that had been running all day. Her manager remembered nothing unusual about her demeanor. She did not rush. She did not linger. When the clock reached closing time, Suzanne gathered her bag, slipped on her coat, and stepped out into the mall corridor, where the air felt cooler and carried the sharp scent of cleaning chemicals. Security guards nodded as she passed. Outside, the parking lot glistened under sodium lights, patches of old snow darkened by exhaust and grit. She walked to the bus stop without hesitation. The CDTA bus pulled up just after 9, its doors hissing open, warm air spilling out as passengers boarded. Suzanne climbed the steps and took a seat. The driver recognized her. She rode this route often, at the same time, on the same days. He would later say she seemed normal, quiet, just another student heading back to campus after work. The bus rolled east toward Albany, tires humming against the road. Inside, the smell of damp coats and engine heat filled the space. Suzanne sat alone, looking forward, her bag at her feet. There was nothing to suggest she was nervous or distracted. No visible exchange with other passengers. No argument. No sudden movement that would later stand out in memory. As the bus approached the uptown campus, the lights of SUNY Albany rose out of the darkness. Tall buildings, wide roads, the circular layout that made Collins Circle a central artery of student movement. It was familiar territory. Suzanne had walked it countless times. What happened next fractured into uncertainty. The bus driver could confirm she had boarded. He could confirm she was no longer on the bus when it reached the end of the route downtown. But when asked if he had seen her exit at Collins Circle, he hesitated. He could not say for sure. There were stops. There were other riders. Memory blurred where precision was needed most. A friend filled in part of the gap. She later told investigators she saw Suzanne step off the bus at Collins Circle at approximately 9:45. The bus doors opened. Suzanne descended. She stood briefly under the lights, then turned in the direction of her dorm. It was a short walk, minutes at most. After that, Suzanne Lyall slipped into a narrow window of time where nothing was certain. Her suite mates in the Colonial Quad would later insist they never heard her return. They were used to the sound of her arrival, the jingle of keys, the soft clatter of her key fob against the door. That night, the suite remained quiet. No footsteps, no door opening, no familiar sounds filtering down the hallway. Somewhere between the bus stop and her dorm, Suzanne vanished. The next tangible trace appeared not on campus, but miles away. The following afternoon, at approximately 4 p.m., a debit card registered activity at a Stewart's Shops convenience store in Albany, at the intersection of Central Avenue and Manning Boulevard. The store sat in a busy corridor, traffic rushing past outside, the interior bright with overhead lights and the smell of coffee, hot dogs, and floor cleaner. The ATM stood just inside, positioned inconveniently for surveillance. The security camera focused on the cashier area, not the machine itself. $20 was withdrawn. To most people, it would have meant nothing. To Suzanne's parents, it was a shock that landed with physical force. Suzanne always withdrew $20. Exactly 20. Never more, never less. It was a habit as precise as her coursework, as predictable as her daily calls home. But the location made no sense. Suzanne did not frequent that part of the city. The clerk on duty did not recognize her. And by that time, Suzanne had already been reported missing. Police later determined that there had been 2 other ATM withdrawals earlier on March 2nd, one in the morning near the Collins Circle bus stop, another at the mall around the time Suzanne would have arrived for work. Both were for $20. Investigators believed Suzanne herself had likely made those. The third withdrawal, on March 3rd, stood apart. Whoever used the card knew the correct PIN. Suzanne had been careful with that information. According to her boyfriend, only 2 people knew it, him and Suzanne herself. The ATM transaction ignited a new line of inquiry. Investigators canvassed Stewart's, questioning employees, scanning receipts, reviewing what little footage existed. A man wearing a Nike baseball cap had used the ATM around the same time. Police sought him out, first as a person of interest, then as a potential witness. When they eventually located him, they found nothing to tie him to Suzanne. He faded from the investigation, leaving behind another empty lead. Back on campus, another item surfaced. In May, Suzanne's Babbage's name tag was discovered in the parking lot near the Collins Circle bus stop, about 90 feet away. It lay on the asphalt opposite the direction she would have walked if she were returning to her dorm. The plastic surface was scuffed. It could not be determined how long it had been there. Forensic testing yielded nothing usable. The name tag offered no answers, only more questions. Investigators began to widen their theories, not out of creativity, but necessity. If Suzanne had gotten off the bus at Collins Circle, what happened in those few minutes afterward? Did she encounter someone she knew? Did someone approach her under the pretense of needing help? Was there a vehicle waiting nearby? Or had the bus itself never brought her back to campus at all? Some officers reconsidered earlier assumptions. The bus driver's uncertainty loomed larger now. What if Suzanne had stayed on the bus past her stop? What if she never reached campus that night? What if everything that followed, the missing name tag, the ATM withdrawal, pointed away from SUNY Albany instead of deeper into it. Each possibility carried consequences. Each reshaped the timeline. Each demanded a different kind of search. As investigators retraced Suzanne's last known movements, one detail surfaced again and again in interviews. She was not reckless. She did not take spontaneous detours. She did not disappear willingly. Whatever happened to her had to fit the person she was, not the mystery others wanted to project onto her. And yet, the facts resisted alignment. A bus ride without certainty, a brief sighting without witnesses, a withdrawal without a face, a name tag without context. Each piece existed, solid on its own, but refused to lock into place with the others. By the time police realized the magnitude of what they were facing, the most crucial hours had already passed. Somewhere in that first night, between the hum of the bus engine, the glow of campus lights, and the quiet of a dorm hallway, Suzanne Lyall's routine broke for the final time, and with it, any clear understanding of how she disappeared slipped further out of reach. The question investigators could not yet answer pressed harder with every passing day. If Suzanne never made it home, then where, exactly, did her path end? Morning came to Albany without ceremony. March 3rd opened gray and cold, the sky low and heavy, the kind that pressed down on the city rather than illuminating it. On the SUNY Albany campus, students moved through their routines, classes, coffee lines, bus stops, unaware that one absence already mattered more than all the others combined. Richard Condon noticed it first. Suzanne had not called him the night before. That alone unsettled him. She almost always checked in after work, even if it was brief. When his calls to her dorm room went unanswered, the unease hardened into something sharper. By mid-morning, he picked up the phone and dialed Ballston Spa. Doug Lyall listened in silence as Richard explained that Suzanne had never come back to her dorm. Mary stood close enough to hear, her hand resting on the counter, fingers tightening with each sentence. When the call ended, neither parent spoke for several seconds. They did not need to. This was not like their daughter. They called the SUNY Albany campus police immediately. The response was calm, almost casual. Officers told them that college students often stayed out overnight without notifying anyone. It was not uncommon, they said. Suzanne would likely return on her own. Doug pressed back, his voice firm. "That's not who she is," he said. "You don't know my daughter." The reassurance on the other end of the line did nothing to quiet the dread settling in his chest. An officer was sent to check Suzanne's next scheduled class. The lecture hall filled, students shifting in their seats as the professor began. Suzanne's chair remained empty. When the officer left, he did so with no report of a sighting. Back at the Colonial Quad, Suzanne's suitemates answered questions in hushed voices. They described the previous night plainly. No one had heard Suzanne return. No keys, no door opening, no movement in the hallway. They were certain. The suite had been quiet. By early afternoon, the Lyalls' worry sharpened into urgency. They began making calls themselves. Friends, classmates, anyone who might have seen Suzanne. Each conversation ended the same way. No one had. Then the phone rang again, and this time the news cut deeper. Suzanne's bank informed them that her debit card had been used earlier that day. At approximately 4 p.m., $20 had been withdrawn from an ATM at a Stewart's Shops convenience store in Albany. Mary felt her breath catch as she processed the words. $20. Exactly 20. That's what she always took, Mary said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Doug asked the obvious question. Had the bank made a mistake? The representative confirmed the transaction. Time, location, amount. It was real. The ATM was nowhere near Suzanne's dorm. It wasn't near her workplace, either. It was a place she had no reason to be. The Lyalls drove there themselves later, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the store, breathing in the smell of coffee and hot food, staring at the machine that had dispensed cash to someone using their daughter's card. The clerk working that shift did not recognize Suzanne. Campus police, confronted with a missing student who had failed to return to her room, missed classes, and whose bank card was being used elsewhere, began to shift their tone. After Suzanne missed another exam and failed to appear for any of her scheduled classes, the case crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a routine absence. 2 days after Suzanne disappeared, the New York State Police were finally called in. Investigators arrived with clipboards, radios, and a sense of urgency that felt both reassuring and belated. They reviewed what was known, line by line. Suzanne's habits, her routines, her last confirmed movements. The ATM transaction, the uncertainty surrounding the bus stop. They began building a timeline from fragments, aware that the most critical hours had already slipped away. Search efforts expanded rapidly. Teams combed the area around Collins Circle, moving outward into the wooded sections of the Albany pine bush. They pushed through underbrush that snapped underfoot, the smell of damp leaves and cold earth clinging to their clothes. Rensselaer Lake was searched, its surface dark and still, reflecting nothing but bare trees and low clouds. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder, methodically covering ground, scanning for anything out of place. In the first 2 weeks, investigators followed 270 leads. They searched 300 acres of land. Each tip sparked a brief surge of hope, then fell apart under scrutiny. Someone thought they had seen a girl matching Suzanne's description. Someone else reported a suspicious vehicle. Each time, officers followed through. Each time, the trail ended. The ATM withdrawal became a focal point. Detectives reviewed the bank records more closely and uncovered something else. Suzanne's card had been used twice on March 2nd as well. One withdrawal occurred in the morning at an ATM near the Collins Circle bus stop. Another happened at the mall around the time she would have arrived for her shift at Babbage's. Both withdrawals were for $20. Investigators believed Suzanne herself had made those. They fit her habits. The third withdrawal, on March 3rd, did not. Stewart's had a security camera, but it was positioned poorly. It captured the cashier area, not the ATM. The person using the machine never appeared on tape. Police canvassed the area anyway, asking if anyone remembered seeing a woman matching Suzanne's description. A man wearing a Nike baseball cap surfaced as someone who might have used the ATM around the same time. He became a person of interest briefly, then a potential witness. When police located him, nothing tied him to Suzanne's disappearance. He was eventually ruled out. Still, the question remained. Who knew the PIN? Richard Condon told police that only he and Suzanne had that information. He answered their questions, provided details of his whereabouts the night Suzanne disappeared. He said he had been playing video games with a friend. The friend confirmed it. His alibi held. But when investigators asked him to take a polygraph, Richard refused. He said he would only speak further with a lawyer present. From that point forward, he declined to engage with the media entirely. To police, his silence became another fact to be noted. Not proof, but not nothing either. As days turned into weeks, frustration crept into the investigation. Posters bearing Suzanne's photograph appeared across campus and throughout Albany. Her face, calm, young, unmistakably alive, stared out from bulletin boards and telephone poles. SUNY Albany and the Lyalls jointly offered a $15,000 reward for information. Tips continued to come in, but none led to Suzanne. Inside the Lyall household, time slowed into something unbearable. Mary replayed her last conversation with Suzanne repeatedly, clinging to details that now felt weighted with significance. Doug kept a notebook by the phone, writing down every call, every update, every name. They slept little. When they did, it was shallow, broken by dreams that ended abruptly. "This isn't her," Doug said to an investigator one evening, his voice steady despite the exhaustion lining his face. "She wouldn't just disappear. Something happened." "Who-es?" The investigators did not disagree. By the end of the second week, the initial surge of activity began to plateau. The search areas had been covered. The leads had been chased. What remained was a growing awareness that Suzanne Lyall had not simply gone missing. She had been taken, or intercepted, or diverted from her path in a way no one had witnessed clearly enough to stop. The case did not close. It hardened, and as the investigation entered its next phase, one truth became unavoidable. Finding Suzanne would require more than retracing her steps. It would require understanding how a careful, methodical young woman could vanish from a campus filled with people, lights, and routines, without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. The question pressing forward was no longer just, "Where is Suzanne Lyall?" It was, how had she disappeared at all? By the time spring pushed winter fully out of Albany, the search for Suzanne Lyall had shifted in texture, if not in intensity. The urgency of the early days, sirens, search grids, officers knocking on doors, gave way to something slower and heavier. This was the phase investigators hated most, the phase where time itself became the enemy. On campus, life resumed its rhythm. Classes continued. New flyers replaced old ones as rain and wind tore at paper edges. Students who had once stopped to stare at Suzanne's photograph began walking past without looking, not out of cruelty, but because the mind protects itself from prolonged uncertainty. Absence, when stretched long enough, starts to feel like background noise. For the Lyalls, there was no such adjustment. Doug and Mary marked time by phone calls from police, by tips that flickered and died, by moments when the house felt too quiet to breathe in. Mary kept Suzanne's room exactly as it was, the faint scent of her daughter's shampoo still clinging to pillows and sweaters. Doug continued to ask the same questions, not because he expected different answers, but because stopping felt like surrender. Investigators, meanwhile, began to revisit assumptions they had initially treated as solid. One of the first threads pulled tighter was the bus. The driver's uncertainty loomed larger with each passing week. He could not say definitively that Suzanne exited at Collins Circle. He could only confirm she was no longer on the bus at the route's end. That gap, once considered minor, now widened into a full alternate theory. What if Suzanne never returned to campus at all that night? Some detectives began mapping possibilities backward instead of forward. If she stayed on the bus, where could she have gone? Downtown Albany offered anonymity, traffic, and opportunity. If she never boarded the bus in the first place, something would have had to intercept her between Babbage's and the stop. Yet no one reported a struggle, a raised voice, or anything unusual in the mall parking lot. Then there was the name tag. Found months later near Collins Circle, it refused to behave like evidence should. It sat 90 feet from the bus stop, in a parking lot, positioned opposite the direction Suzanne would have walked toward her dorm. No one could determine when it had been dropped or placed there. It could have been lost days earlier. It could have been moved. It could have meant everything, or nothing at all. The case accumulated these contradictions without resolving them. A convicted rapist who had violated parole and fled the area around the time of Suzanne's disappearance briefly drew attention. His history made him an obvious candidate for scrutiny. Police tracked him down, interviewed him, verified his movements, and ruled him out. Another door closed. A coworker at Babbage's added a detail that unsettled investigators more than it clarified. About a month before Suzanne vanished, she had mentioned feeling watched, followed by someone she didn't recognize. She hadn't sounded frightened, the coworker said, more puzzled than alarmed. She didn't change her routine. She didn't ask for help. In retrospect, the admission felt like a warning whispered too softly to hear in time. Police pressed harder on Suzanne's personal relationships. Richard Condon remained cooperative to a point. His alibi for the night Suzanne disappeared held up. A friend confirmed he had been with him, playing video games. But when detectives pushed beyond the timeline, into emotional territory, into the nature of the relationship, Richard pulled back. Mary Lyall noticed details that investigators couldn't ignore. Suzanne had tried to end the relationship before. Mary remembered the tension in her daughter's voice during recent conversations, the way she seemed pulled between obligation and reluctance. After the disappearance, Richard told police Suzanne was his fiancée. The word landed heavily with her parents. Suzanne had never mentioned an engagement, not once, despite speaking to them almost daily. It didn't sound like her, Mary said quietly to a detective, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She would have told us. 2 weeks before Suzanne vanished, Mary and her daughter had stopped at Richard's house so Suzanne could drop off a Valentine's Day card. At the time, nothing seemed unusual. Years later, Mary would wonder if that stop had been something else entirely. If Suzanne had been trying to end the relationship in person, choosing kindness over distance, and whether that decision had carried consequences no one could see. Police could not prove any of it. Suspicion, without evidence, remained just that. As the investigation dragged on, comparisons began to surface. 13 years earlier, another SUNY Albany student, Karen Wilson, had vanished after boarding a bus not far from where Suzanne was last seen. Karen had been 22. She was last observed near Central Avenue in 1985. Like Suzanne, she had never been found. Like Suzanne, authorities believed she had been abducted. Detectives examined the cases side by side, laying timelines over one another, searching for overlaps, roots, suspects, patterns. The similarities were unsettling, but not enough. No shared witness, no common suspect, no concrete link. The cases remained parallel lines that refused to meet. Time continued to stretch. Leads slowed to a trickle. The reward remained unclaimed. Officers rotated on and off the case, but the file stayed open, thickening with notes, transcripts, and unanswered questions. Suzanne's disappearance settled into that uncomfortable category. Law enforcement never names out loud but always recognizes unresolved. The Lyalls refused to let it become invisible. Doug and Mary began reaching out to other families of missing people, searching for guidance, for solidarity, for proof that endurance mattered. They learned how often early delays cripple investigations, how frequently young adults were dismissed as runaways, how many parents had been told to wait. "This shouldn't happen again," Doug said to Mary one night, his voice low but certain. Not to anyone. Grief began to harden into resolve. By the time a full year passed without answers, Suzanne Lyall's case had entered its darkest phase, not because it was abandoned, but because it persisted without reward. Each new day without progress deepened the ache while dulling the urgency in the public eye. Still, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a quiet determination remained. Investigators continued to check tips. Mary continued to listen to her instincts. Doug continued to believe that truth, however delayed, did not erase itself. And though no one could say it yet, the disappearance of Suzanne Lyall was already changing more than the lives it had shattered. It was beginning to expose cracks in systems that assumed too much and waited too long. What had started as a search for one missing student was slowly becoming something larger. The only question was how long it would take before anyone realized it. Years passed, not all at once, but in layers that settled quietly over the Suzanne Lyall case. Investigators never announced it as a cold case, but the texture of the work changed all the same. Tips came in less frequently. When they did, they arrived by phone calls that began with hesitation, by letters written in careful handwriting, by conversations that circled uncertainty before landing on speculation. Still, every lead was logged. Every name was written down. No one officially walked away. Inside the New York State Police, the file grew thicker, heavier. Pages yellowed. Photographs faded slightly at the edges, but the core questions remained sharp. Did Suzanne leave the bus at Collins Circle? If she did, how did she vanish in a place filled with streetlights, passing cars, and students walking back to their dorms? If she didn't, where did the bus take her? And who was waiting there? The ATM withdrawal refused to loosen its grip on the investigation. $20. Exact. Methodical. Whoever used the card knew not only the PIN, but Suzanne's habits. Detectives replayed that detail repeatedly, not because it changed, but because it didn't. Habits like that did not form by accident. They suggested familiarity. They suggested someone who had watched her closely, or someone who already knew her well enough to imitate her without hesitation. The possibility that Suzanne had been stalked resurfaced again and again. Her co-worker's statement, once a footnote, now carried more weight. Suzanne had mentioned feeling watched. She had not known who it was. She had not appeared frightened. Investigators wondered whether that calm was part of the danger, whether Suzanne's confidence in routine had made her vulnerable to someone who understood it better than she did. Police explored known offenders in the region, not just those with violent records, but those with access, people who moved easily through spaces Suzanne occupied. One suspect briefly rose above the rest, a convicted rapist who had violated parole and left the area around the time Suzanne disappeared. For a moment, the theory felt promising. His movements were traced, his timeline checked. When police finally interviewed him, the details did not align. He was excluded. Another possibility collapsed. The case did not reward momentum. In 2005, a new name entered the conversation: John Regan. Regan was facing trial for a 1993 kidnapping in Connecticut. That alone made investigators take notice. Then came the arrest in Saratoga Springs, not far from Ballston Spa, where Regan attempted to abduct a female student by pulling her toward his van near a high school. The method, brazen, opportunistic, violent, forced a reckoning. Could Regan have been active years earlier? Could Suzanne Lyall have crossed his path? Police approached him carefully. The timeline worked loosely. The geography made sense. The behavior fit a pattern. But when investigators questioned Regan about Suzanne, he refused to talk. He offered nothing. No denial. No confession. Silence. Without cooperation and without physical evidence, the theory stalled. It joined the others in the file. Documented. Plausible. Incomplete. Around the same time, another comparison resurfaced with renewed intensity. Karen Wilson. 13 years before Suzanne disappeared, Karen, also a SUNY Albany student, vanished after boarding a bus on Central Avenue. Like Suzanne, she was never found. Like Suzanne, authorities believed she had been abducted. Detectives laid the cases side by side again, tracing routes, reviewing witness statements, revisiting old maps. The similarities were unsettling enough to demand attention, but not enough to sustain a case. No shared suspect emerged. No definitive overlap in evidence. The parallels remained haunting but legally useless. As investigative avenues narrowed, the Lyalls found themselves targeted by a different kind of attention. Psychics began to call. At first, Mary dismissed them outright. Then the number grew. 75, by her count. Each claimed insight. Many described water, rivers, lakes, submerged places where answers waited just out of reach. Mary listened, then set the phone down, frustration tightening her jaw. The Capital District was filled with water. Rivers crossed highways. Lakes dotted maps. Vague certainty was not the same as truth, and yet, one detail lingered with her. Whenever Mary drove across the Crescent Bridge, spanning the Mohawk River between Albany and Ballston Spa, she felt something she could not explain. Not fear, not certainty, just a persistent pull, a sensation that made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter, her eyes drifting toward the water below. She did not tell many people about it. In 2016, a reporter from the Daily Gazette accompanied her as a local firm applied high-tech mapping technology to the riverbed beneath the bridge. Equipment hummed. Screens flickered. The water moved steadily overhead. Nothing conclusive was reported. The river, like so much else in the case, gave nothing back. Inside law enforcement, the tone shifted quietly but decisively. By 2018, a senior investigator with the New York State Police spoke plainly. "We believe it's a homicide," he said. The words landed heavily. They did not close the case. They reframed it. The possibility that Suzanne had simply left, started a new life somewhere, had not been entirely dismissed, but it no longer guided the investigation. Reality pressed harder now. In 2023, police confirmed publicly that the case remained open and classified as a missing person investigation. Multiple interviews had been conducted, they said. Information continued to be shared between campus police and state authorities. They would not disclose who had or had not been ruled out. For the Lyalls, the lack of resolution did not dull the impact. Doug passed away in 2015 without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. Mary continued on alone, carrying both grief and purpose with equal determination. What had changed was not the evidence, but the meaning of the case. Suzanne Lyall's disappearance had exposed a flaw that went far beyond one campus or one investigation. In the earliest hours, Suzanne had been treated as a college student who might reappear on her own. That assumption had cost time, and time, in cases like this, was everything. Doug and Mary refused to let that lesson disappear with their daughter. They turned outward. They studied other cases. They spoke to other families. They learned how often missing young adults fell into a gray zone, too old to trigger immediate national alerts, too young to be taken seriously as independent runaways. With each conversation, their resolve hardened. "This can't be how it works," Mary said at a meeting, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. No parent should have to convince police that their child matters. The search for Suzanne had not produced an arrest. It had not produced a body. But it had produced something else. Momentum. Legislators began to listen. What started as a personal tragedy began reshaping policy, slowly but deliberately. The Lyalls learned how to navigate committees, how to speak in rooms where pain had to be translated into procedure. They told Suzanne's story again and again, not as a plea, but as evidence. And as the years accumulated, one truth became impossible to ignore. Even without answers, Suzanne Lyall was no longer just missing. She was changing the system that had failed her. What remained unresolved was the one thing no law could supply. The moment when her path was diverted, the person who stood in her way, the decision, planned or impulsive, that ended her routine forever. The truth was still out there. The question was whether time would ever loosen its grip enough to let it surface. By the time Suzanne Lyall's name began appearing in legislative chambers instead of missing person bulletins, the meaning of her disappearance had shifted. The search for Suzanne herself never stopped, but alongside it grew another mission, born from the same absence and carried forward by the same people who refused to let her vanish quietly. Doug and Mary Lyall had learned, painfully and precisely, how the system treated missing young adults. In those first days after March 2nd, 1998, they had watched hesitation replace urgency, assumptions replace action. They had been told to wait. They had waited, and in that waiting, time had slipped away. They decided it would not happen again. Within a year of Suzanne's disappearance, the Lyalls began lobbying for change in New York State. They were not politicians. They were parents who learned how to speak the language of law because no one else would speak for their daughter. They studied other cases, including that of Kristen Smart in California, where similar advocacy had already begun to reshape policy. They met with legislators, shared Suzanne's story repeatedly, and explained, again and again, why delay mattered. The result was the first law to bear Suzanne's name. On April 6, 1999, what would have been Suzanne's 21st birthday, Governor George Pataki signed New York's Campus Safety Act into law, widely referred to as Suzanne's Law. The statute required colleges and universities across the state to establish formal procedures for responding to missing person cases and serious crimes on campus, and to report them promptly to state authorities. Institutions were given until the start of 2000 to comply. It was not justice, but it was acknowledgement. The Lyalls did not stop there. They turned their focus to federal law, identifying another gap that had complicated Suzanne's case. At the time, local police were only required to notify the National Crime Information Center when a missing person was under the age of 18. Suzanne had been 19, legally an adult, practically invisible to national systems designed to mobilize quickly. Doug and Mary pressed forward. In 2003, President George W. Bush signed the PROTECT Act, a sweeping federal bill aimed at protecting children and young people. Included within it was another provision known as Suzanne's Law, raising the age for mandatory NCIC notification from 17 to 21. The change also allowed law enforcement to involve the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in these cases, unlocking resources like age-progressed imagery and nationwide distribution. Again, the Lyalls marked progress, but not closure. That same year, while attending a conference for families of missing persons, Doug and Mary heard a woman speak about choosing action over isolation. "I could have stayed in bed with the covers over my head," she said, "but I decided to get out there and talk about this." The words stayed with them. They decided to do the same. Mary Lyall began speaking publicly, not just about Suzanne, but about the experience of losing a child to uncertainty. Together, she and Doug founded the Center for Hope, an organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and educating law enforcement about their expanded responsibilities under the new laws. The center became a place where grief turned outward, where information was shared, and where families no longer felt alone in navigating systems that often felt indifferent. In 2008, their efforts culminated in another federal law, the Suzanne Lyall Campus Safety Act, enacted as part of the Higher Education Opportunity Act. It required colleges and universities nationwide to clearly define how campus police, local police, and state agencies would coordinate during investigations of violent crimes and disappearances. The goal was explicit: to prevent the confusion and delay the Lyalls believed had hindered Suzanne's case from the start. Even now, legislation bearing Suzanne's name continues to move slowly through the New York State Legislature. One proposed law would increase penalties for violent crimes committed on or near educational facilities. It has passed the state Senate multiple times. It has yet to be voted on in the Assembly. The work continues. For Mary Lyall, activism never replaced the search. It lived alongside it. Tips still arrive. Some are vague, some are hopeful, some are unbearable. She listens carefully, then measures each against reality. She knows how easily hope can be exploited. She also knows how dangerous it is to abandon it entirely. When asked where she believes Suzanne is, Mary answers honestly. She does not claim certainty. She does not pretend peace. She speaks instead of persistence. New York State Police continue to investigate the case. In 2023, they confirmed publicly that it remains open. Multiple interviews have been conducted. Information continues to be shared between agencies. They will not say who has been ruled out, and so Suzanne Lyall remains suspended in time. She is 19 years old in every photograph. A computer science student. A poet who chased ideas with wet hair and bare feet. A daughter who declined borrowed money because she believed she could manage on her own. A young woman who stepped onto a bus after work, expecting to be home in minutes. The walk from Collins Circle to her dorm never finished. What endures is not just the mystery of what happened to Suzanne Lyall, but the impact of her absence. Laws changed. Procedures hardened. Families found a voice. Systems learned, slowly, imperfectly, that waiting is not neutral. Suzanne is still missing. But because of her, fewer people are told to wait. And until the truth of that night is known, until someone, somewhere, speaks, her story remains open, not just as a case file, but as a reminder of what vigilance costs and what it can change. If you care about unresolved cases, about the details that were missed, delayed, or ignored, subscribe to this channel for in-depth true crime stories told with accuracy, restraint, and respect. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case waiting to be heard. Because silence lets stories disappear, and remembering is sometimes the only justice left.